So welcome to the Broadcast Meets IT Theatre. This morning's session is the Newsroom, Journalistic Creative Demands versus Broadcast Technology. And on the panel this morning, we have, at the far end there, Trainor, who is Managing Director of Deluxe Media Technologies. And next to him, Wardle, Director of News Services at Storyful. And we also have Kathey Battrick, Director of Operations at ITN Source. And next to me, Audrey Heaton, Head of Libraries and Archive at Sky News. And on my right, we have Peter Coles, Technology Controller, BBC Journalism. And just at the end there, we have Steve Sharman, who's Chief Technology Officer at Mediasmiths. So we want this discussion really to be about the technology that's used in newsrooms, and really to kind of look at whether or not it helps or hinders the storytelling process, and to try and assess what journalists are struggling with and where the opportunities lie for technology to step in and help. So to start with, Peter, in this multi-platform and multimedia world, is it fair to say, do you think, that journalists have never been under so much pressure?
I think it's absolutely true to say that the audience expect us to join up the story and tell a consistent story across platforms. And therefore, it does inevitably apply pressure back on the chain. And there's no doubt that we're having to think quite hard and work quite hard to join up things that perhaps in the past would quite adequately have been able to operate as independent production areas. So that's actually where the complexity lies, is how you enable journalists to collaborate, how you enable them to know everything that we know so that they are able to prepare content, be that still many for just one platform, but increasingly needing to be able to present their story and feed material that's going to serve multiple platforms.
Yeah. So what would you say are journalists' biggest frustrations at the moment?
Well, I imagine they've got quite a few, actually.
Yeah.
But certainly one of the things when I go round and if I talk to an editor in a regional station or a local radio station and ask them what's the one thing they would like technology to provide for them, the response that I will often get is not, repair this bit of kit, make this bit of kit work, but it's when my journalists go outside the newsroom, they are automatically out of touch with what is going on. They're disconnected from the production systems. They're not able to see and communicate in the way that they're able to in the newsroom. So actually the biggest challenge is how we can begin to open up those systems and make those available so that the journalist is as connected when they're out close to the story as they are in the newsroom.
Do you think it's a reasonable expectation for journalists in the field to have the same tools, same kind of capabilities as their colleagues?
It's certainly our ambition to get to that place. It's a goal. It's a vision. It's a stretching one. Not least because of the connectivity, but also because a lot of our systems to date have been architected around server systems, etc., that are, almost bound by the physical four walls of the newsroom. Now, we're doing an awful lot to shift that, to connect our systems up and to join them, and to provide journalists with mobile tools that actually connect them back to base. So we've, for instance, developed an application, in-house application that actually is surfaceable on tablets and smartphones, etc., where the journalists can quite easily shoot a piece of material, record a bit of audio, write a piece of text, clip it up, and post it back to the correct destination, so to the right local radio station, etc. Now, those sort of things are beginning to open things up. We need to do a lot more in that space.
Yeah. Joe, I just wanted to, startled you a little bit there. I wanted to ask you about standardisation on this particular part of the topic. Specifically, to what extent you think that newsrooms are standardising around metadata, codecs, and what kind of impact that's having on the news gathering process?
Well, to what Peter was saying earlier on, the fact that there's siloed systems and disparate pieces of data and metadata throughout these systems, and they're built in a way which means it's difficult to crack into them, to extract that and use it in other areas. People talk about, okay, we've got to standardize across the industry, we've got to extract data so that it's useful and valuable in multiple ways. So we've got to have a standardized process for doing that, whether it be codecs and metadata structures and standards. I think it's kind of a distraction to try and build a single standard that's going to be fit for everybody. It's impossible to do it because the world that I come from is more around the world of enterprise search and big data analysis. And there's no such thing as a standardized model when it comes to understanding data in all these different disparate repositories of content and databases. And the way you've got to look at it is, well, what is the use case that I'm trying to extract from this? And whenever we've sort of, from a technology side, we've gone into the various different newsrooms and asked the question, well, what is it you want to do? And the feedback has been from the use case, which is journalists want to know what they have, and they want to know if they can use it, right? And that's a very big question if you think about they don't know where their assets are, discovery's a big problem, how are they going to be able to understand where the repositories sit to actually open up which one they need to look into, when in reality there's got to be a way of extracting all that data, making sense of it and applying it to the use case that the journalist wants to use, which is, oh, do I have any images of Barack Obama? Do I have the rights to them? Can I use them? And those sorts of questions are what people think is the answer is about standardized metadata across multiple repositories of data, whereas there are other approaches to trying to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Yep.
Audrey, Joe touched on the archive side of things there, and it's obviously a vital part of the storytelling process. How do you guys make sure that those assets that you have are accessible to journalists?
Yes, accessible to journalists, so the human being comes in. So a journalist in the field is connected to a production team in the newsroom, and historically that's how they get their information, on the phone, and they rely on that. I think journalists aren't, in my experience, fast to take up technology. They want the person they trust to tell them information, and trust that they have sourced it and found it reliably and that it's relevant to the story. So technology, yes, and also technology, it occurred to me when you were saying how journalists in the field need to capture what's available, what they can script around, depending on the platform that they're scripting to. They'll change how they tell the story depending whether they've got pictures for it or not for television, but it'll be different for online or iPad. Different platforms lend themselves to different stories and different storytelling. But equally, from my perspective in News Archive, it matters, of course it matters that we provide for the journalist and for production, but it matters very much that the people in the field and on the news desk on the day, in fact not just on the day, within a small tranche of a few hours, capture the information about all of the news gatherings, so stuff that isn't necessarily from archive, and capture that information so that it goes back into the archive asset. And that is critical because, in fact, good information lives in the newsroom, flying across different desks, on the phone, between the field. All of that information, to capture it is very, very difficult. And we found in News Archive that we can't stand back and wait to be at the end of the process and be in receipt of it, because we could wait, we may as well be in Timbuktu. It's not how the newsroom works. We need to come forward into the newsroom and capture that information that at the moment is just, as I said, communicated verbally on the phone or between news desks. So there's a full circle here. That very same material that we're capturing today is what we're going to be delivering to the journalists tomorrow in the field with good data. So we find that every day everybody across the newsroom is doing a lot of the same grunt work, researching the same information, and it's not necessarily getting into archive. So when the story comes up again, we're all doing the same thing again. So I think it's the to and fro of information. And that's part of education and culture as well, as well as technology, I think.
Kathey, how do you guys go about making sure that journalists are well behaved and giving you all the information that you need?
And we're quite lucky. We've been digitising the archive since, on the day since 2006, and I think at that point it gave the newsrooms a greater visibility of the output of the archive. So there's very much a lot of buy-in from from both newsrooms that we archive. That the quality of their metadata and their sourcing at the very beginning is the basis on which we create our metadata in the archive, and then they will then again use later on to locate that archive should they want to use it again. And it's also the metadata we create that the ITN source businesses then use to commercialise the archive, but for the business.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of buy-in all round. Even if there's a lack of, it's very it's a basic running order that we get with the sourcing information. If that sourcing information is not given to us, we can't provide the copyright information back for the newsrooms should they want to use it at a later date.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of buy-in, and there is, as you say, there's a lot of ongoing communication on a daily basis by email and by phone, just to verify facts, to follow up on information. But actually at the heart of it all is really our Avid system and iNews. We're accessing the bulletins and the rushes directly from the newsroom servers, and we're archiving from that, and we're using the production logs in iNews to base our metadata on that, and actually watching the video.
And when we spoke before, you mentioned about weekly reports that get sent round to journalists about unsourced content, and that helping to to kind of make sure that they're on top of it all.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of pride, I think, that's given to the volume of sourcing or correct sourcing that gets given to the archive, and we do give the newsrooms a weekly update on how they're doing. Pleased to report it's going good. But yeah, we give them full visibility of the volume of unsourced content.
Steve, I just wanted to bring you in here. It's obviously an enormous task digitising these massive archives, tens of thousands of hours. Do you think it's possible to prejudge the commercial value of an archive before you digitise it? And what's the best way for an organisation to approach that process, do you think?
That's a really difficult question, because I think the obvious answer is no.
Yeah.
Because in reality, something like a news archive has incredibly large value at the point you actually need to use it. Whereas the point where, as opposed to kind of lots of historical entertainment programming, where you can release it on DVDs and things like that, there isn't necessarily a kind of a continuous beat rate. So you almost have to be in a position where you digitize the lot and make it accessible, or alternatively you index the lot and have a very, very slick process for getting at what you need very quickly. In order to be able to derive some value out of it.
Yeah.
But it's in many ways it's not a we've kind of got digitization down as a process. So it's not a technology issue; it's a business one, and it's and increasingly it's not just about the kind of the cost of the business of doing it. It's the opportunity cost lost of not doing it, and also the effort that you have to put into things like kind of, do you have to go out and do rights clearance again, and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And Peter, the BBC is working towards one archive of which BBC News will be part of it. Can you just tell us a little bit about that process?
Well, so that's absolutely the where we're working to, is a kind of if you like, the deep archive. The back-end archive would be a common archive searchable across the whole of the BBC, so that the whole lot is there. But we've been taking a kind of a stepping stone approach to that, to get to that point. So currently our material sits in our work in progress system, and then gets moved off into separate spinning disk, which is managed by archivists and dealt with. Now, the reality is that that's what happens with what was happening with our network news operation. But if you went round and looked at a lot of our other operations, it was actually, you'd find lots of different island systems. So what we've been doing is trying to get ourselves to a relatively standard approach, not least about the metadata schema that we use, but also the way in which we're storing that and archiving that, which is taking us to the point that then enables us to be able to move that off into a deep archive. I mean, the reality is we've been storing proxies against our media, which actually is really helpful in terms of going and discovering what we've got. We've been doing that since about 2005, which actually, and much the same as with ITN, is actually really opened up the ability to be able to discover material.
Do you find that that journalists find kind of searching for assets a natural process? Because I think one of the trends that we're starting to see is systems that are very much more oriented around managing things by story, and asset management systems aren't oriented towards managing things by story.
So I think story is absolutely the way to go. I think the reality is that a journalist will generally use what's there, what's available, and in fact what we have is we have a newswire operation that actually goes, and their job is to go and get best pictures. So they will go and get the stuff from the archive, they will look at everything that's coming in, and they will try and surface that so that the journalists can get hold of it. But I completely agree with this concept of beginning to think about story, and it comes back to the multimedia angle that we started with, that in reality, what you're really wanting to know is all the information from planning right the way through to the content that you have and the interviewees that you have on that story. Those are your assets right the way through the chain. And that's been something that's been quite hard to date. We've made a move in that space. We've built something called the Journalism Portal, which is it's built out on SharePoint, but quite a rich development that is actually really helping us begin to join those dots and bring together story communities that happen with breaking stories and also happen around sort of ongoing long-term activities. And that's helping bring these pieces of information together to help the journalists to discover and actually help us know what we've got, which is a big issue.
Joe, one of the tools that that you guys are involved with promises to be able to watch content, listen to it, and understand it just by using computers rather than people. So does that spell the end of archivists as a role, or?
No. In the most basic sense, the toys that we've got open up video, play in the video, watch it, listen to it, identify people in it, extract text from the screen, understand what people are saying, and create a very rich repository of metadata around that asset, which gives us what we would call a sort of the DNA descriptor of what that asset is. So, of course, people have their own metadata structures about taxonomy, archivist processes for logging, and the human-based data that has to go around that as well. But what we're trying to do is identify the nuggets within content and extract data and information from inside a video asset and not relying solely on the manual processing of humans to create data around an asset. And the reason for that is to enhance discovery. You know, back to the point earlier on is the asset library systems sit in multiple repositories across the business. And the goal for us is to extract all that metadata, enrich it with video analysis technology so that when it comes to discovery and it comes to utilization of that asset, a journalist, if they type in a title like, oh, I'm just looking for faces of Obama, if it's not tagged correctly in a traditional structure, then it mightn't be discoverable, but because we have facial recognition capabilities, it'll start to surface that information. So it's about allowing that to happen is what we're trying to do. We're not going to replace the whole process, but the whole goal is to improve the efficiency of the discovery process, whether that be to help in planning or in story creation or in execution of a task, whether a journalist is in the field or on site. So that's the capabilities that we're trying to bring.
Yeah. And so is that going to help journalists collaborate across newsrooms, do you think? People who are working on different platforms, is that really what the goal is there?
Yeah, what we've done is trying to understand, because we're technologists, so I'm not an expert in the news world. So, but what we've tried to do is bring in analysts to understand the process from the morning planning session right through to the delivery of a story, and understand where can we add value throughout that life cycle, and actually, to use Audrey's point, move the journalist back up the process into where the asset and the information is coming in, so that they can actually utilize it earlier on and understand what's available at their fingertips, regardless of where they are. I think Peter Coles, in relation to the journalist portal, the collaboration tools that they're looking at is not just about enrichment of metadata that we're doing, but it's also about the human process that Kathey led on to and Audrey understands. as well.
But we are beginning to extend that into looking at semantic tagging. So right through from going right back to the multimedia point. One of the things we have is that that our director of news said was a requirement was every first responder to a story needed to send a piece of text back for that story. That's the first thing they needed to do when they arrive on site. Now, that sounds very straightforward, but how do you get that piece of text to the right place as quickly as possible? And actually, at the moment, we have some methods of doing that. We know that a correspondent might be using a particular cell phone number. We know that. We can relate that. We can do that in the journalism portal. We can therefore say we're confident that that piece of text can go straight out as a flash wire, and we can get that out. But actually, in an ideal world, that would be something that was automatically tagged as it was being written. It was being, some kind of extraction was going on that tags it back against a known ontology that tells you, yes, this is that story, this is about that, and this relates to this, and actually you know then exactly what it is. It can go to the right journalists on the right services automatically because it's embedded. In effect, you've put metadata in by tagging it, and you can use that to direct. Now, that's quite powerful. You start then beginning to take those links and those tags and begin to create relationships and associations around them in the sort of way you're talking about. We're looking at quite a lot around linked data, about how we can use that to begin to build a picture and begin to understand everything that's going on. For instance, all the stories that are happening in a particular geography. How many stories are we covering at the moment in Birmingham? And who have we got deployed there? So if a story happens over here, can we see on a Google map or something? Those are the sort of powerful things that help the internal audience, the journalist, as well as feed right the way through to how the audience may be able to look at our content in the future.
And that's context, and that's where we're learning from online about contextualizing a story much more. And to pick up on your point, George, is at the end of the archivist's role. I think it's the day of the archivist, and they can be freed up from the processes of archiving and logging things because the technology can support them in it. But what they know to do is to bring back out all of the assets contextually and present them to the journalists, because what they are expert at is receiving the call that doesn't always make a lot of sense from the journalist in the field or somebody who's under a lot of pressure, and that is exactly what you were saying about the story-led. The story is king, and these people know, because from being archivists, their core skill to my mind is that they are researchers. These people know, especially if they're helped by systems that intelligently pair information, whether it's picture, stills, text, whatever, planning, right from the planning stage all the way through, and integrating into the cogs of the news gathering, so extracting the information on the day from the newsroom. If they can be across all of that and be freed up from some of the more historically tedious tasks of processing data, manually adding logs, but know about it because they're so intimately acquainted about it, then they become so key to the process that they come into their own as researchers. So the archivist is how onerous those tasks have been is getting lighter. The amount of information is better, but their ability to draw it all together and to respond to the need of the journalists on the ground by story and by platform is where I think actually it's the day of the researcher, not the archivist. Yeah.
Claire, I just wanted to ask you about the user-generated content side of things. We're talking about the volume of information, these huge number of assets that people have to stay across. It's really been compounded by user-generated content as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so I work for Storyful, and we're a social media news agency. And we have a newsroom where basically our journalists have 5 screens, and they're a bit like market traders, and they're just looking at these streams of information. There's 72 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute, 700,000 pieces of content shared on Facebook, 100,000 tweets, that's every minute. And it's eye-watering. Like, we can sometimes have 40 Twitter lists open in our tweet decks, just scanning across what's happening. And the thing is, 99% of the stuff shared on the social web is not useful for journalists, but 1% is the golden nugget. It's the person who films the helicopter crash or the balloon crash in Luxor. And increasingly, because people have smartphones, they happen to be the people who are there. They're not necessarily citizen journalists. They're people who happen to be in the right place at the right time. So interestingly, thinking about archive, we've developed a 2-year archive of the Arab Spring and Costa Concordia and Hurricane Sandy that's all on YouTube. And newsrooms are increasingly having to rely on user-generated content, but the two big questions there in terms of technology are discovery. So how do you discover that clip? How do you discover it early? And then how do you verify that? And once you've verified it, then you have to talk about rights management, all of the things that we've been talking about here, but the tools to find stuff hasn't really changed. I've been training journalists for the last 4 years, and when I do my training courses, it's still about how to use advanced Google search, advanced Twitter search. There's no really good discovery engines. We've had to build in-house multi-search technology that allows us to put in keywords and search Reddit and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter all in the same place. We just don't have those things in place, yet newsrooms are becoming increasingly reliant on social content. Yeah. We can talk about the finances of all of this, but ultimately it's because increasingly the best authentic footage is coming from the person who happens to be there at the time with a camera. So I think there's a real market there for technology that's understanding how to discover the best content and surface the best content that's beyond what's trending, because we're trying to find YouTube videos at 8 views. We're not waiting for it to start trending at 500,000. We need that footage before anybody else, and that's really where I think some of the biggest challenges lie.
Mm. But that slightly notorious video of the eagle stealing the child, which was picked up by a few news organisations, doesn't that show that we're still a long way from being able to properly verify these clips?
Yeah, I think verification, many people, again, when I do training, say, I didn't know that. People don't know what they don't know. And actually, there's really interesting questions here around newsrooms saying, this purports to be something. And if you take the eagle video, and also yesterday, it was unearthed that the pig saves the goat. Did anyone see the pig saves the goat video? Another classic viral. Transpires that was a hoax from 6 months ago. And actually, when you do verification checks and you check the uploader history, the weather, you geolocate it on Google Maps, you look at the metadata, you look at EXIF data, there are a number, we do 7 steps. It's very complicated to do verification properly. Journalists in newsrooms, hang on, I'm under pressure from the editor to get the picture up, and you're telling me that I have to do all of these checks. But if we don't do those checks, where does this take us? Because actually, this space has changed so quickly, and it's very easy to say, and some of the wires do this, we can't verify this because it's user-generated content. Well, that's wrong, because there's a number of different checks that we can do, and I think we're living in this kind of, it's okay to be ignorant of that, and the audience are fine with it. Well, we're in a pretty troubling space if we just assume that we can't verify user-generated content. So there's a lot around education, but there's also around technology. How can we collaborate? So why should 200 journalists in 200 different newsrooms be verifying the same YouTube clip of the balloon crash in Egypt? That doesn't make any sense either. And there is that kind of golden hour in journalism just after a breaking news event when journalists should be collaborating with each other. And once the facts have been made straight, then let's go off and do our storytelling around it. But let's not try and be competing with one another to get the facts right, because that's what's causing things to go wrong. In the Sandy Hook shooting, there were 12 false facts put out there by mainstream media around the identity of the shooter, the mother was meant to be a teacher. That was just before Christmas, and for me, that was a turning point of, we can't pretend anymore and stay ignorant. We should be collaborating that golden hour, because we're actually pushing each other competitively to make mistakes, and it's not helping the audience. I'll get off my soapbox, thanks.
Do you think that one of the solutions could be for news organisations to tie up with social media sites, like we've seen with Bambuser, AP? Is that one way to overcome these hurdles, do you think?
I think it's really interesting, and part of the problem here is that if I take a picture of a cat falling down a toilet, I can make a lot of money off YouTube. If I'm a Syrian activist, there's no way for me to make that money because I don't get those hits off YouTube. And I think the platforms do have a responsibility to recognize that they're now becoming integral to the news process. And how can we actually do this in a way that, yes, AP have tied up with Bambuser, and I'm going to say this publicly, I do have some problems with the fact that a Syrian activist is owned by AP, and so I think we're in that space now where we have to be working together to say, how can this work effectively? How can we come up with proper licenses? So it might be a public service license if it's a Syrian activist. Creative Commons on Flickr works very well. There's nothing really like that in the same level of detail for YouTube. Actually, we should be working with the platforms and saying, as newsrooms we're using it, can we talk properly about rights management, licensing, and protect the uploaders and allow everybody to actually be part of this process and stop being like, oh, it's free content because it's UGC, because we've moved past that and it's 2013.
Peter, the BBC obviously has a lot of experience of monitoring different feeds, output of various news sources. How are you using that experience in the user-generated content landscape?
So I think, as you say, we not least because of the number of foreign language services that we have, but also because the BBC has a unit called BBC Monitoring, which does some of that kind of monitoring of public media. Actually, there's quite a lot of research experience, and it comes back to the research point. It's about understanding context. So one of the checks that will quite often happen alongside your 7 checks and all of that sort of stuff is actually somebody on our UGC hub will ring somebody either in BBC Monitoring or in one of the foreign language services and say, tell me, is this context right? You know, this person in this situation talking about this, does this feel right? Does this fit with the rest of our research? And actually, at the end of the day, as much technology as you apply, it comes down to the fact that a news organisation is really about its journalists. And it's about that human perspective. It's about telling that story. So the technology will help us pull the information together more rapidly to enable the journalist to tell the story. But let's not forget that it's the journalist who tells the story, who makes that association, who does that verification, and not the technology.
Yeah. Okay. Steve, I wanted to move the conversation on slightly now, and just really to talk about the way in which broadcasters implement technology.
Yeah.
How, in your experience, how do they build these planning cycles, or build these change cycles, sorry, into their planning?
Oh, I think it's I think the broadcasters as clients have got a really horrible job. In fact, almost as horrible as the suppliers now. In that, what we're actually talking about is we're talking about a need to see very, very fast evolution of technology to deal with things like social media. It's not just a question of in 3 years' time our sort of EMPS system will be able to take Twitter feeds in. It's I need to do this right now. And I need to be able to build features and functionality and take advantage of that right now. That simply isn't going to be. If I wait for 3 years, which is kind of the usual technology refresh cycle, it's not going to happen. And at the same time, they have to get the news onto the air, and it has to be reliable, and it has to be verified, and all of the business problems that we've seen. And you know, there are a lot of sort of folks that say, okay, well, it's easy, just put all these things together as cloud services. Okay, but then you've got sort of the reliability thing again. So it's all very well saying it'd be great to plot all these incidents out on Google Maps until that just kind of 5 seconds into a breaking story when you lose your connection to Google and you can't plot it anymore. So that they suffer from lots of different issues. And I don't think we're anywhere close to addressing that at the moment, because I think we kind of have a couple of problems. One is that the guys that supply traditionally newsroom systems into broadcasters, they are, you know, although they're relatively big companies in the broadcast space, they're still tiny, and they have limited budgets for R&D, and they have to kind of take their bets on where they're going, and sometimes it's just upgrading some of the base technologies. They're still based on really, really old stuff, the stuff that Peter was talking about, tied to clusters of servers just sitting in the corner of the room. So they kind of have that problem. And then they have this problem of how do you take in things like a desire to go to story-based. I mean, for the newsroom systems, kind of always been story-based. Asset management systems haven't. Other systems haven't. So it's how do you start to take those things in, and then for the newsroom, how on earth do you actually take those things in and implement it and keep going?
But there is stuff that we can do. And,
Yeah, oh,
and I
absolutely.
absolutely recognise all those challenges. But for instance, just talk about, we've got 38 local radio stations around England. Big challenge, how do you replace the kit in each of those? Well, you put a man in a van, probably 2 men in a van actually, and you send them around the country for many months in order to do that. Well, so one of the things we've done and we've piloted and we're well on the road to doing is actually saying, well, we'll take all that back-end technology and we'll stick it centrally and we'll provide a web client and we'll use the power of the network, IP connectivity to provide the control surface for the sound desk, and actually the install now in the local radio station is about 2U, whereas all the kit's back in base. Now, the ability to actually do an upgrade to that, to do a refresh on that, is actually much, much easier than it has been in the past. We've piloted that live with Radio Northampton for about 6 or 7 weeks. We're now building out to 4 stations. We plan to do that across all 38. Now, you can make those changes, but this is quite big stuff for us. It's a big move from the way in which the supply industry has operated, the broadcast supply industry has operated, and sell their products, because they're quite happy to sell us boxes for 38 sites, and for us to then be quite dependent on them. And it's a big shift. It's much more of a shift towards the IT world.
Yeah, nature of I think one of the recurring themes of a lot of discussions at shows like this is the nature of the broadcast technology business is changing, but there's still I think there's still a kind of hardcore of folks who would prefer it not to, and I don't think those are in the clients. I think they're in the suppliers. So in many ways, we've all got to work on dragging those guys into into the place where we need them to be. Yeah,
Steve. You mentioned about the fact that there's some people not wanting to sort of change so quickly. One of the big things that we have to break down barriers in when we go into these environments is actually trying to interrogate these various different silos of data, whether it be the planning tool, the archivist tools, the library systems, or the digital asset management systems. We find one of the big job that we have to do is to sort of crack those open. Yeah. And they're incredibly siloed technology stacks, which don't really like to open up their doors to stuff.
Completely.
And one of the big steps in my mind is that for them to be more advanced, to be able to be more flexible, to offer, to your point, be able to feed tweets into their platforms, is to be more open about allowing that technology to be shared across the board. And I'd like to get your opinion, because you have to install this stuff, as to why they won't do that.
Well, I think there are 2 things. I mean, historically, this is a business where kind of talking open and remaining closed has always allowed you to protect your base, if you like. And then I think, frankly, the other reason is that that actually, historically, we're talking about organizations that, in many ways, are very, very good at doing things with managing video, but actually they're not very good software engineers. And this is a business which is increasingly trending towards being software-driven. And that's, I think if there's anything that we're starting to see, it's people starting to the light starting to dawn a little bit in certain places, and that's encouraging. It's hopeful.
Would you agree with that, Peter? Does that?
Absolutely, and in fact, we're finding that a lot of our conversations with suppliers, and you talk about the newsroom computer systems, absolutely with those, it is about getting the ability to be able to integrate, having clear, published, open APIs that actually allow you to be able to get in and out of those systems. We don't see those as a vertical stack anymore. No. We see those very much in a world where we can integrate something like our journalism portal, where actually we're managing that much more like a product, much more on an agile development, because at the end of the day, the technology is supporting a workflow that is rapidly evolving, and it's rapidly evolving because of what our audience are doing and what they require. I can't sit here and tell you what the workflow is going to be exactly like in our newsrooms in 3 years' time. I can tell you the trends that we're going to have and the areas where we're going to need to adapt and change, but I can't plot that out. So how can I go to a software supplier and to a supplier and say, build me one of those, here's my list of requirements, build me one of those, because by the time they deliver it, it won't be what the journalist wants. Even if it was what they said they wanted, they'll say, but that isn't what I need now. The cycles have got to get shorter. We've got to get more into open standards, integration, and product management.
I agree. I don't think you want to guess at the workflows. Cross-platform hasn't really come in yet. We tend to go tele to online, but perhaps with the journalism portal or the equivalent where you have a hub of story-based information, then everybody can just eat off that rather than try and divine which way, because nothing's linear there. Everything in the end will connect. And in a news gathering day right now, everything connects. You cannot establish a linear workflow in the newsroom at all. And even archive isn't at the end of it. I think archive is potentially at the beginning.
And in a true digital world, which I don't think we've even begun to go into, we'll be moving into a space where the audience will expect to have all those entities that we join together very neatly in our television galleries and paste together into a nice screen. They will expect to have all those entities plus other information actually delivered to them for them to surface on their platform in the way that they want it, with time associations, etc., adding in other personal information. That's the world we're moving into. It's a fundamental shift, which is going to require us to think about the architecture of our workflows and our systems in a completely different way.
Okay. I just wanted to open up now for any questions. Just before we draw to a close. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask the panel? Any questions? Yes.
How big an issue is security if journalists in the field with, say, iPads and wanting to access all the core software back at base? Is that a big issue?
Who would you like to target that? Is that for Peter or?
Yes, Peter. Yeah.
Massive issue. It's a massive issue, and something that actually we need to grow our understanding, because the challenge is that actually we want that connectivity, we want that openness. We've tended to sort of have a very hard shell around the way in which we've built stuff to date. That doesn't really quite work in that way. So we need to find it much more porous. We need to be doing a lot more about being confident that what you've sent from here is the same as arrived here, and you're actually comparing one thing against the other, rather than perhaps the approaches we've taken. But it is a big issue.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Hi there. You talked about sort of social curation and news coming from now social media. Is there any value in adding sort of a rating or a trusted source to that type of news, so that you can form some identity that who can be trusted?
Yeah, so the engine of Storyful is that we have over 600 Twitter lists, and everybody on that Twitter list for Afghanistan or Syria or Connecticut are people that we know are on the ground and they're trusted. So if they say the ground underneath my feet is shaking, we're 99% certain there's an earthquake, but we'll still do the next checks. But it's absolutely about networks that you trust and that you know. And so the Congo rebels are sharing lots and lots of information on Facebook. If you know that patch and you know who's who on Facebook, it's the same way as if my patch was Birmingham, I'd know who was who. So yeah, the combination of discovery with trusted past uploader history and have we worked with them before is absolutely key to this.
And is that something you'd expose, or is that something that you just use within your network?
No, all of our lists are public. So Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I think there's a lot to do with educating the audience about this in terms of how verification works. But also, we give out tips to people to say, if you want this to be used by a news organization, Syrian activists have learned to pan up and show a really obvious building on the square, and they will show a newspaper so they can show the date. So people are becoming more savvy in terms of how verification works. So yeah.
So I think we've probably got time for one more question. Oh, yeah.
Hi. I myself am a documentary maker, and I often end up traveling in and find myself in conflict zones. But because I'm always focused on whatever I'm doing, I'm terrible at knowing how to finance my projects and make cash out of them. And so I'm wondering, when you talk in the way that you do, is there any kind of avenue that someone like me like a traveling camera person can send stuff and actually, instead of just putting it on YouTube and never getting any income for it, but getting thousands of hits at times, sort of get some income from it.
Clip sales perspective, we represent collections of content at ITN Source. We obviously manage some of the big collections, ITN, Reuters, ITV, Channel 9, Fox. There are some smaller collections and some smaller sections of content that we represent, often content actually that's appeared on a news bulletin because the newsrooms have bought it in from a source that we sometimes will represent. So there are, if there's some real unique content that's going to be generally of quite international interest, then potentially, there's the commercial sort of clip sale route. But then I guess there's also looking at the ad revenue. It's not exactly my area of expertise, but then there's also the ad revenue from click-throughs on video platforms as well. So with an archive, I guess really it'd be a case of just really letting them know what you've got. And normally the archive house will make an assessment as to whether, I'm not selling us necessarily, but as to whether that's something that is a good fit for their customer base. I mean, the content really will definitely define the suitable archive house. So obviously some archives will have more of an editorial focus, and you've got other archive houses that will maybe have more of a kind of corporate and advertising customer base. So it depends on your content set, your content type, the way it's been shot, and how unique that content is.
Also, your material may be really valuable when the story becomes the story on the news becomes relevant to what you're filming. So I would suggest you would get to know news desks for major broadcasters, and they'll bite your hand off if they know you're in the right region when they want picture relevant to that. So if you're across the news agenda and you're in a region that's of interest to the news right now, make yourself known to very small groups of people, really, I would say, in organizations who won't forget you. They've got lists of contacts, and they similarly learn to know that you're either reliable or not, shoot well or not, are able to send the pictures back quickly or not.
Okay. That's all we've got time for. So thank you all very much for listening and taking part, and thank you very much to the panelists.